Assalamualaikum and hi everyone. Today we will be diving into the chapter 5, responses of plants to environmental stress. We'll talk about what happens to the plants when their environment suddenly changes and how they cope with it. This topic is super important, especially with the unpredictable weather and the climate change that we are seeing today. Okay, so what is plant stress? Basically, plant stress, it means something bad happens to the plant's environment, like a sudden change from the nice, stable conditions to something less ideal. And this sudden shift disrupts the plant's normal balance or what we call the homeostasis. When a plant is happy, everything is balanced. But when the environment becomes too hot or too cold or too dry or something else that changes drastically, and the plant will get stressed. There are two main types of stress, the abiotic and the biotic. The abiotic stress, it comes from the non-living things, such as the light, temperature, water, or the chemical exposure. Meanwhile, for the biotic stress, it comes from the living organisms, like the insects, pathogens, or even competition with other plants. If the stress is too much, the plant may stop flowering, they won't produce seeds, and they might even die early. And this is what we call these plants are susceptible. But not all plants are weak. Some are very smart, like the ephemeral desert plants. These guys, they live super short lives. They sprout, they grow, and they reproduce very quickly right after the rain, and then they die, all before the dry season hits. And this is what we call the stress avoidance. They don't fight the stress, they just avoid it. On the other hand, some plants, they develop the stress resistance mechanism. They stay alive and they keep functioning under the tough conditions by adjusting themselves. And this is what they call the acclimation or the adaptation. And we will explore these two terms next. This is just a recap or the summary of the many types of stresses that the plants can face. So for example, for the abiotic stresses, they can have drought, salinity, heat or cold, and also the light stress. The examples for the biotic stress, for example, like the herbivory, like when the insects eat the leaves, fungal infections, bacteria, or the viral diseases. By understanding these stress types, it helps us to figure out how plants can respond or how we can help them to survive. Now let's look at acclimation. This is when a plant goes through short-term changes to survive in a very tough environment. It's not permanent. It's more like an adjustment to help them keep going until the conditions improve. So for example, if a plant is exposed to a sudden drought, it might start closing its stomata so that they can reduce the water loss, and that is acclimation. Acclimation is kind of like our body adjusting to the weather changes. So for example, if you go from Malaysia to a cold country, we might feel super cold at first, but after a few days, our body gets used to it. So are the plants. So plants are the same. They start with the rapid short-term responses. For example, like they close the stomata, they produce certain proteins, or even they change their metabolism. But if the stress continues, then they will move into the long-term acclimation. They might grow deeper roots. They might change their leaf size, or they might change their leaf orientation, or they might also adjust how they do the photosynthesis. In the long-term acclimation, the plant goes through more permanent-looking changes. For example, they will modify the root system so that they can get an access to the deeper water, or they will increase the wax layer on the leaves. They also might change their leaf orientation so that they don't get sunburnt. So these changes, they all help the plant to function better under the prolonged stress. But they still go back to normal if the environment improves back to the normal condition. Now let's talk about adaptation, which is totally different from the acclimation. Adaptation is long-term and also is genetic, meaning it happens over the generations. So these are the traits that the plant is born with because of the natural selection process. For example, the cactus plants, they are naturally adapted to deserts. They have thick skins, they have the reduced leaves in terms of the spines, and they can store water because these features, they are already part of their DNA. So to summarize, acclimation is short-term, temporary, and also flexible. However, for adaptation, they are long-term, inherited, and part of the species. So plants that are adapted, they can survive where other species can't. And this is what we call as the stress-tolerant species. Let's look at specific examples now. Obligate shade plants, they are species that must live in the low light conditions. So for example, under the forest canopies. Their photosynthesis machinery is designed to work well in shade. So for example, if they are exposed to the full sunlight, they will and they can get sunburnt, and that will damage their cells. Then there are obligate sun plants. It's the opposite, meaning they love the sun and they need the full light to survive. Here is the interesting part. If you suddenly grow a sun-loving plant in heavy shade or in the low light condition, it will start to etiolate. So that means that it stretches out and it becomes pale and they look weak and they look leggy. Because etiolation is one of the plant's way of trying to reach more light, but it's very risky because in some cases, if the light levels are too low, then the plant's respiration process, it will exceed the photosynthesis, meaning that for the respiration, they use more energy than they can reproduce. So if this continues, then the plant can die. And this happens when the plant is way below the light compensation point, meaning that the minimum light needed for photosynthesis to balance the respiration process. So to wrap up, plants, they face many kinds of stress from both living and non-living or abiotic or biotic stress. Some plants, they avoid the stress. Some do the acclimation and some are very well adapted to survive the condition. By understanding these responses, it will help us to design better agricultural practice and also it will help us to choose the right plants for the right environments. And that's it for today's lecture. Thank you.